Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and this week I'm here with Mike Simmons and Mike Connor, the co-founders of Catalyst Sale. Hello, Mike and Mike.
Hey, Jody.
Hi, Jody.
Well, Mike Connor, it's great to have you back. Mike Simmons and I talk about you all the time when you're not here.
I know. I get random messages every once in a while from people that make jokes about things that I have no idea what they're talking about. So I have to go back and listen to get the context of what they're ribbing me about. But yeah, thanks for keeping me in your thoughts.
We're actually thinking about changing your name. Just so you don't get those. Yeah. Go with Connor. Go with Jack. I mean, you can go with a number of different names. What name would you like?
I don't have a preference, I guess. Whatever you guys think works.
Well, Mike Connor has worked well so far.
It's gotten me this far.
There you go.
Nobody can spell it, but you think it's a pretty easy name, but yeah, nobody can really spell. In fact, I'm going through that right now with a client where I'm being introduced to new people, and it's amazing to see how many iterations of my last name come across in the internal messaging. It's funny.
I still don't understand how they confuse the E and the O.
Well, it's ORS, Connors. So they're adding letters too.
Yeah, like...
Well, Mike Connors, it's fitting that you're here this episode because this is a very special episode. Do you know what it is?
I've had it on my calendar for a while. This is the century mark. So we're at episode 100.
That's right. 100 episodes. When we started this show, did you envision making it to 100 episodes?
Yeah, I think I did because, the feedback right out of the gate was pretty encouraging. And I think we've just followed the numbers as it's kind of crept along and just realized that, people are seeing value in listening to us ramble about all kinds of topics. And I think when we got to about the 30 or 40 mark, I thought we'd probably run out of topics or things to talk about. And by adding guests and really expanding beyond just, sales discussions, I think it's really stayed relevant and interesting. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the next 100.
And it's a really neat to see just the level of engagement we're getting. I mean, the number of direct messages, and I know, Mike, you joked about some of the inside stuff that you're seeing, but we continue to get messages from people who are listening to the podcast. We see you engaging with us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, through direct messages, and through hello@catalystsale.com. So keep that coming. In addition to the engagement increasing, we're seeing adoption increase. So it's good to know that everybody out there is finding value in the content, the guests that we've had. We've had some amazing guests. One of the most popular podcasts, for those of you who are new, one of the most popular podcasts we had was with Don Miller from Building a Story Brand. And we'll include a link to the show notes there. But that today is the most popular podcast, almost by a factor of 2.
Oh, he was such a great guest. That was fun. Well, since we're talking about guests, when we started this show, it was the two of you mostly. And then slowly guests started to creep in. And now guests are a big part of the show. What value has having guests on rather than just the two of you brought to the show?
One, I get to talk less, which is good.
Yeah, and I don't have to talk at all sometimes. That's great.
And still hearing my voice drives me nuts. But I think the biggest piece about guests are getting their practical experience and being able to see this thing that happens across all roles. Because some of the guests that we've had on are not in sales. We've had some marketing folks on. We've had some operations folks on. We've even had a pilot on. We've had a number of different people on the podcast, and those experiences apply to what we all do when it comes to sales. In fact, we actually got feedback from one of our listeners, Kara North, where she had highlighted that we all do sales. And she's on the learning side of the equation, on the learning side of our audience. She's an instructional designer. And just to get that feedback from people and how we're impacting those that are outside of the direct sales community is really exciting.
Oh, yeah, that's great. It was so good to see that sort of feedback. And I think maybe we'll get into more of that, what other people have said about the show and what they've taken out of it. But I'm curious now, 100 episodes in, we'll start with you, Mike Connor. What have you learned from doing 100 episodes of Catalyst Sale Podcast?
Well, what I've learned is that we've been able to kind of do this in parallel with work that we're doing every day for our clients and for people that we're helping, apply a lot of the things that we're talking about. And I think one of the things that I've learned is we certainly don't know everything. And what's really surfaced from having guests on the show is that there's just so much more to learn. And, the more diverse, our guests are, the more topics we can kind of broach into. It's very helpful for us too. We're learning alongside, the listeners. And I think that's been a lot of fun because a lot of times when we're working with companies, we're not just focused on sales. We're focused on just about every facet of an organization and trying to drive organizational improvement, and learning from others is something that's, it's always valuable. I don't think we'll ever have a point in time where we say we know everything.
And what about you, Mike Simmons? 100 episodes in, what have you learned?
I think the big one is when we first started doing this, we were scripting everything out. I mean, we actually gave you a list of questions that we wanted you to ask Jody, and it just sounded like crap. We talk about getting away from sales scripts when working with customers and scripting out templates and whatnot. And yet we tried to do that with the podcast, and it didn't feel very natural. The other thing that I've learned through this is how long it takes to build an audience and build a community and build that level of engagement, but also how important it is to build that engagement one person at a time. Those one-on-one interactions that we have with people who are listening and who are impacted and who are able to apply what we talk about are really exciting to hear and see.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that. And in podcasting, for lack of knowing what else to call it, I just call it the field of dreams problem, because so many people think in the field of dreams, that voice says, if you build it, he will come. And people have the perception, if you record it, he will listen. And it doesn't work like that. It's a lot of patience and time and work to build an audience. And it all starts with great content. And now you two have put out 100 episodes of great content. Simmons, you mentioned in the early days that to you, it didn't feel as good as it does now. And perhaps that's true, but still that early content was still great. You guys have been putting out great content this whole time, even if maybe the delivery feels better now than it did then.
Well, thank you.
Well, I think the other thing we realize now is post-production does miracles. So I think at the onset to this thing, we thought, okay, well, you've got to record everything exactly right. And not knowing how the editing process and all that works. I mean, you certainly work your magic, Jody. So I think we have a lot more confidence that all we need to do is talk and you can make it sound all right.
Yeah, so many times now when we're in front of a group or we're doing, facilitating a session or involved in a workshop, I wish we had that editing capability. I feel like I go back to those uhs and ums, and we're working on it. But yeah, post-production editing is a beautiful thing.
Well, since we're being candid about that, there's a behind-the-scenes look at how we operate at Catalyst Sales. Sometimes in the middle of a podcast recording, we will just break off into a separate conversation that needs to be removed because it has nothing to do with what we're talking about or something else. And that happens really quite often. And we just take it out. But that's part of the beauty of podcasting is you can do things like that.
Well, I think one of the things, so if you're a podcaster out there and you don't do this or you've not taken the opportunity to do it, you may want to consider it. But many times when we have a guest on, one question that we'll ask that won't be recorded or will be off the mic is there anything that you wanted to make sure that we covered that we didn't in the discussion? And it's amazing the stuff that comes out. It's also amazing the questions that will come out where they'll say, yeah, it'd be really great if you asked this question. We're coachable. So getting those questions back from the guests are really good.
Yeah, that does really help. Now, I want to share with you guys one thing that I learned from you through listening and being part of this content for 100 episodes is that you get better at what you're doing by going outside your area of expertise. When we started doing this show, I thought we were always going to talk sales, and I would always be mining sales content from both of you. But then as we started bringing in guests, it hasn't always been sales. I think, was Lee Cockrell our first guest?
I forget if it was Lee or it was Dan. I get those two confused, but he was either number one or number two on the guest.
And he talked about time management, right? That's outside the area of expertise. And you look at some of the other guests that we've had on the show, they're not always talking about sales. And yet it does tie back to sales and help you get better at sales. So that's one thing that I've certainly learned from this show.
Well, and I think the comment Mike shared a second ago where he said, a non-salesperson is listening and getting value from the podcast. I think there's perceptions that, sales is really, it's a defined set of activities and, you have your scripts, you have your process, and you basically just execute and repeat. And reality is that comment, was made that, we're kind of all in sales. That's true. I mean, everybody that's customer facing, everybody that has, any kind of exchange with a customer or the market or anything like that, to some extent, that's why the book To Sell is Human and things like that. We really are all in some sort of sales capacity if we don't have a sales title. The same can be said about a salesperson, is that a salesperson really, and one of the reasons we named the company Catalyst Sale is because so many times it really isn't that core, sales process execution that makes a salesperson successful. It's the thinking that goes around being a salesperson and the things that you have to know, the business acumen and the relationships and all of these things that you have to know. It's a pretty broad spectrum of things that you want to develop. And I think that's what we've tried to do, is go beyond just the rote process and here's the marching orders and here's your scripts and go execute. But it's more about how can you be a well-rounded business professional. And I think in order to do that, we really wanted to expand beyond just the mechanics of sales. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really happy to see this has kind of evolved into. This isn't a podcast where we're talking about the same shtick over and over and over again. And we're always trying to break into new areas to help round people out.
Yeah, that is good. And you're right on. That's what this show has done, is go into the different areas and start rounding off some edges and getting better at things like time management and having discussions about things that maybe I would think you don't see coming in a sales podcast. Discussions about hiring better and discussions about glass ceilings and that sort of thing. So Mike Simmons, you've done a wonderful job at determining who would be a good fit to blend into the content that you and Mike Connor are producing here.
Yeah, and it's not just me, it's the community. It's the network of people who are listening, who are making those recommendations. I listened to a couple of other podcasts, and I don't think I've ever come across a podcast that's sales focused. At least I don't recall seeing this, where feedback loops were discussed with the level of detail that Dave Burke was able to discuss those, and getting into the OODA loop and how important that is. We talk about iterative process. We talk about being agile, but to have Dave come in and talk about those feedback loops and the importance of taking action, and that to me was one of my favorite episodes or favorite discussions that we've had, because it bridged this gap between someone who's doing something completely different than sales and how it applies in sales.
Yeah, that was such an interesting episode. I was a little surprised when Dave was a guest and just loved how that went. What a great show. Mike, would you want to get into a little bit of what we've heard from other people about what they enjoy about the show? And then that'll give us an opportunity to go a little bit deeper on those.
Yeah, we got some feedback from Ethan Munoz, one of our listeners, and one of them, he came back and he said that Don't Boil the Ocean from the territory planning episode was really important to him and impactful to him. It helped him be smarter and more targeted and more focused in his prospecting efforts. So it's great to hear that feedback from folks. And Mike, when you think about Don't Boil the Ocean, what comes to mind for you?
Well, when I think about, don't try and boil the ocean, it's trying to take on too much and do too many things and overthinking things. And sometimes I think a lot of the episodes, what we try to do is get practical with small components of a much larger problem and execute on those things well and consistently, and not try and overthink everything.
Yeah, just over and over again, you get this piece of focus and how important focus is. So Ethan, thanks for the feedback.
Okay, so there was some good feedback from Ethan. Mike, what else have you heard? I know you've really had your eye out knowing this 100th episode was coming up. You've been looking for some of what people are saying about what they've got from the show.
The other one that was pretty interesting, and this comes from another person in the learning space, Craig Seibert provided some feedback around the differences between coaching and mentoring and how that impacted his thinking, and how often those two ideas, those concepts, and then add in training, how often those concepts are confused and referred to in the same sentences or in the same discussion. So knowing that there's a distinct difference between coaching, training, mentoring. And then I thought it was really interesting when Dan Cockrell was on and he added how important it is to not only have a coach, a trainer, and a mentor, but also have an advocate inside your organization. So I know many times you can get into vocabulary semantics and they can take people off track. It's good, again, to get feedback from people on how those detailed discussions apply practically in their role, again, whether they're in sales or in another role.
Yes, and Craig mentioned that's what stood out, the difference. And prior to us talking about it, he hadn't even really thought about that before. And he realizes he even said a stark difference between the two. And so you bring up a good point that some of that can just be somebody playing with vocabulary, talking about coaching, mentoring, advocate, teacher, but there really is a difference. And that's the type of topic that I think it's been really valuable to go into and see how stepping a little bit outside of sales really does matter, to talk about coaching and training and the mentoring, the difference between all of them. Mike, Connor, so we've talked about some of the feedback that we've gotten, and I know people have reached out to you and told you things that have mattered to them on the show. Give us an example of something you've heard.
I think one of the things, I know we heard this feedback from a friend of ours, James Potts. He's somebody we've worked with for a long time and have really valued helping him with his early stage transition into sales and so forth. But one of the things that he had mentioned was that the idea of getting out of a slump really hit home for him at a time when, he had hit a plateau, and the idea that you really just need to stay focused on the process and you don't have to search for, a silver bullet or some magical answer, but just really focusing on the fundamentals and having faith in the process and knowing that, if you're consistent, that you'll get out of that slump. And so I think that's something, and I've heard that from other people too. And I think that's something that we all deal with, even in our business when we're dealing with clients or we're trying to find new opportunities and things like that. We just know that in the heat of the moment, if we stay consistent, things are going to work out fine and that the highs and lows kind of level out and so forth. So I think that was a big one. And then another theme that I think I've had feedback on is really being customer focused and doing right by the customer and knowing that if you do the right things by your customer, and that can be internal or external, but just doing the right things will lead to good outcomes, and knowing that taking shortcuts and doing things that might seem to be a good idea at the time really don't pan out, and just staying the path. So I think those are a couple of themes that that I've had feedback on.
Yeah, this is great. I love hearing that feedback, because this is the one thing, if you don't have a podcast, that you may not realize, because when you hear us, it's like we're there with you, is we do this, just the three of us, and we're not in front of people, and you don't always hear feedback like you would if you were presenting in front of a crowd. So it's always wonderful to hear back from people and know that the words you're saying and the show you put out every week actually makes a difference.
Yeah, and I'd like to just reinforce that to the community again, is keep that feedback coming, keeping engaging with us on Twitter. Twitter's a great way to engage with us directly. I mean, when you see me tweet, or you see Mike tweet, or you see Catalyst Sale tweet, that's us doing that directly. We don't have those scheduled out. So keep the feedback and keep the engagement, keep the questions coming. Another piece of feedback that we got, which I thought was kind of interesting, and this kind of goes back to that learning. Brett Schlenker is the host of TLDC Cast. And if you're in the learning space, I would suggest following TLDC. He made that entry point into sales from a learning role. And all of the information that was out there was about how easy this is and do these individual steps. And what he likes about the podcast and the information that we deliver out there is how he could take things that maybe everybody would talk high level and conceptually. He could take the practical information and start applying it, test it, and then adjust his approach. It's not as easy as some people make this sound. It is not as easy as some will lead you to believe. You've got to do the work and you've got to find your own style. So Brent, thanks for the feedback on that.
Well, as we've been saying, 100 episodes in, we've heard a lot of feedback. We've learned a lot. What can we look forward to in the future of the Catalyst Sale podcast, Mike and Mike?
More guests. We'll continue to add guests on here. Really would like to see us bring in some additional technologies in here. We've had a couple of different sales stack technologies, founders of those companies join us and talk a bit about what they're doing. And we had Rob Schell from CN.ai, and we had the guys from FunnelWise come onto the podcast. So I think getting some of the additional technology providers on here who can actually talk about practical application, not the marketing speak and the stuff that you can get from their website, but the more functionally why they were compelled to solve the problem that they were trying to solve. Some technical founders, I'd like to see us get them on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the number of inquiries we get now about, becoming a guest. And I think that's been interesting too, because when we get people that are actually sharing ideas with us and saying, hey, I've been listening to the podcast. I either founded a company or, I work with a technology that I think would be really relevant to share with your audience. That's kind of nice to see. And I'd encourage more people to do that because that allows us to also pick topics maybe we wouldn't have thought of that, people share with us. So I think that's kind of interesting to see sort of people coming to us now and saying, I'd really like to talk about this topic and here's the story behind it and all that good stuff. And obviously we want to vet those and we don't want to turn this into a podcast about a promotional podcast for products. But at the same time, we realize that as sales professionals and as sales leaders, that's an inevitable part of what we have to deal with every day is optimizing that technology stack and making sure that it's adding value and solving problems for our teams. So I would expect that we'll see more of that, in the future.
And I think another one of those, just as you were talking through that, Mike, it's maybe even getting some practitioners out on the podcast. So people who are a little bit earlier in their career or maybe later in their career, but had multiple instances of the same experience 3 or 4 times over. But people who are applying the concepts that we talk about, the approach that we talk about, the skills that we talk about, and how that has impacted their workday. So again, sharing additional practical application with the audience. So if you're a listener out there and you'd like to share a story about how you've applied concepts that we've discussed, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Mike and Mike, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. And rather than talk about guests and this podcast, I want to bring up, again, all the great work that Catalyst Sale does. Because as we've gained new listeners to this show, we've talked about guests, we've talked about sales, but let's talk about what Catalyst Sale does. So give us some more background on that. The company Catalyst Sale, not the podcast. What is the work that Mike and Mike do for Catalyst Sale?
So the work that we've been doing most recently, I would say there's 2 categories. I would say that there are early stage companies that are probably at the stage where they've got a product that's in their MVP stage and they're looking for funding, or they're right at that point where they're going to, they're ready to obtain their funding. And we're helping them to really formulate their plan from a sales perspective. So what does the ramp up look like? What does the structure look like? What's the sales strategy? All those good things. And then the second category would really be Plateau companies that have reached a certain stage and they've recognized that they've kind of run their full playbook and they've leveled off at a certain point and they're trying to figure out how to reinvent themselves or kind of go to the next level. And I think both of those categories, our clients would fit in one of those 2 stages. And that doesn't mean that they're all startups or anything like that. I mean, some of these companies have been around for 10 and 20 and 50 plus years. So everybody hits a plateau at some point. But and most recently, I would say it's interesting too, is that through that process of helping companies sort of break from that plateau, we've also had a couple of them that have either gone through acquisitions, to facilitate the next level of growth, or have received additional investment. And so that they're ready to grow beyond that plateau that they were at when we first were introduced. But most of the work we're doing right now is still hands-on, helping get things done. We don't just give a playbook to a company and say, here, go do this, execute on this, and you'll be fine. We roll up our sleeves and we do the work. So we're actually generating revenue, making sales, working with different areas of a business to help sales collaborate better and more effectively with, product development, with operations teams, just really helping round out companies that are kind of in a growth mode that just need a little bit of expertise.
Yeah, and it's in those instances where we work with the other groups like operations or product, it's about demystifying that sales process and helping those groups collaborate and communicate with each other. I think one of the keys that you hit on there that differentiates us from others that are in the marketplace is doing that work. We go in, we test the ideas and concepts that we have, we get the market feedback, we adjust, we iterate, and then work to build to scale. And we know the process works. It's repeatable. We understand the timing, and we're fortunate enough to work with a number of clients on their initiatives, whether it's breaking through those plateaus that Mike had described, getting into an emerging market where they don't want to disrupt another area of their business, or they're early stage and they want to be really careful about investing in a VP of sales too soon. Maybe they don't have that product market fit, or their success to date has been limited to friends and family, or purely founder led sales.
Well, as we wind down this great episode, our 100th, what is the one message you want to leave, the mark maybe that 100 episodes has left on you, or one message you want people to remember from 100 episodes of Catalyst Sale?
Know that we're practitioners. We do the work, and the podcast will continue to evolve and will continue to get better based on the work that you share with us and the questions that come in and the engagement that you have. So I just want to thank everybody for listening, thank everybody for engaging, and look forward to continue to see how this journey evolves.
Yeah, I would just kind of reaffirm that a little bit and say, we really love getting the feedback. It keeps us, in a creative space where we don't end up in an echo chamber. So the feedback that comes in from each one of these episodes is it's basically creating the roadmap for what we want to do going forward. So I just would encourage people to reach out and just let us know kind of what you're dealing with and see if maybe we can structure an episode around, whatever those challenges are. We're certainly open to addressing just about anything.
And the best way to get a hold of us is through hello@catalystsale.com. You can also go to our website, which is catalystsale.com, and you can connect with us on Twitter, which is @CatalystSale, or directly at mconnoraz and @Simmons_M. So thank you.
Yes, wonderful. And you can find the past episodes of the show on the website, catalystsale.com. They're also in iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play. Anywhere you find podcasts, you'll find Catalyst Sale. Well, thank you so much, Mike and Mike, for 100 great episodes. And thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale podcast.